Flying single-engine airplanes can be challenging and fun. Now, imagine the excitement of taking the next step and adding a second engine to your flying experience. This is Sporty's What You Should Know series program on transitioning to multi-engine airplanes, a program that looks at the world of light twin flying and shows you what it takes to join this exclusive club. Your host is Rob Ryder, an instrument-rated pilot who is a real aviation enthusiast. Rob serves as announcer for various air shows and also hosts many other Sporty's video programs, including the What You Should Know Private Pilot series. Now, let's join Rob as he begins to explain what you should know about transitioning to twins.
Hi, I'm Rob Ryder. Welcome to Sporty's What You Should Know series program about transitioning to twins. This video volume will present a number of generic concepts and procedures for flying light twin-engine airplanes. It is not a substitute for competent instruction or the procedures defined by the manufacturer of your airplane. Your instructor should explain the procedures and policies unique to your training aircraft and local operation. Follow the guidance of your instructor and the manufacturer of your twin.
If multi-engine flying will be your first experience in a complex or high-performance airplane, you might also want to review High Performance Single Engine, a title in the Sporty's Air Facts series. In the program, Richard Collins explains the nuances of flying complex and high-performance airplanes. The requirements for obtaining a multi-engine class rating are described in Part 61 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. If you are adding the rating at the same level as your existing single-engine pilot certificate, you must show proof of training and take a practical test. No knowledge test or minimum flight times are required, provided that you already hold an airplane category rating. If you don't hold an airplane category rating at the certificate level for which you are applying, you and your instructor will need to spend some time with the regulations to determine the requirements. After obtaining an unrestricted multi-engine rating, you are legally permitted to fly any multi-engine airplane that does not require a type rating. Of course, you will also need complex and high-performance endorsements in your logbook when these are required. Remember, just because it is legal doesn't mean that it is prudent. If you obtained your multi-engine rating in an airplane having the engines positioned to the front and rear of the fuselage, your certificate will be issued with a centerline thrust limitation. Removal of this limitation requires a second practical exam in an airplane with engines positioned away from the fuselage center. Flying a multi-engine airplane can provide redundancy for critical systems. This provides the opportunity for safer operations when something breaks. The added complexity and additional systems also mean that the chances of something failing may be greater. One thing that you will notice in your training is that things happen more quickly in a twin. When something does fail, you have to be on top of your game to improve your chances of a safe outcome. A pilot with a bit of rust on his skills can be much more dangerous in a multi-engine airplane than in a single. This rust factor is likely one of the primary reasons why flying light twins has not historically proven itself to be safer, even though the opportunity is there. Once you earn the rating, plan a program for recurrent training. Stay fresh on the normal and abnormal procedures for the airplanes that you fly. Well-trained and current pilots prove every day that multi-engine airplanes can be flown safely even if something does go wrong.
Multi-engine airplanes are complicated aircraft, but don't be overwhelmed by all the systems, switches, and controls. If you've flown a complex single-engine airplane, you've probably seen many of these before. Building on this past experience is a good place to start.
The flight controls will function the same on your multi-engine training aircraft as in your single. The controls may feel a bit heavier, but you're likely operating a heavier airplane. Your multi-engine trainer may have more trim controls than found on a typical single-engine trainer. The addition of rudder trim is common, and aileron trim is not unheard of. You'll want to use all of the available trim controls as you progress in your training. Traditional twins have pairs of mixture, propeller, and throttle controls. Having two levers for each function allows you to make adjustments for each engine on its own. Corresponding to these controls, you'll find two indicators for EGT, propeller RPM, and manifold pressure. The indicators for each engine may be on separate gauges or a combined gauge with a left and right needle. You'll also see separate engine indications for other important parameters, such as oil pressure and temperature. The landing gear on your multi-engine trainer will function similarly to what you may have seen on a complex single. Some controls that look the same may have slightly different functions that are unique to multi-engine airplanes. The propeller control is one example. Takeoff and cruise positions are the same, but notice there is now a position called feather. This position is used when an engine fails and will be discussed in detail later in this program. Completely new systems may also be present. With two propellers spinning outside the cabin of your training aircraft, you'll want to have them rotating at the same speed. This is known as synchronizing the propellers. Syncing the props reduces their noise level and removes a pulsing sensation heard in the airplane. Your training aircraft may have a system for automatically synchronizing the propellers. Another new system found on many light twins is a dedicated heater for the cabin. This type of heater burns gas from the tanks and provides heat through its own ductwork. This overcomes the difficulty of getting heat from the wing-mounted engines into the cabin for cold weather flying. Take a look at the V-speeds for a multi-engine airplane, and you will see a number of familiar items. You'll also see some new speeds that you may not recognize. These speeds are related to multi-engine emergencies and operations with only one engine running. We will briefly define them here. Those important to light twins will be discussed in more detail later in the program. VMC is defined as the minimum control speed with the critical engine inoperative. VSSE is the safe intentional one-engine inoperative speed. This is a speed that your instructor will use to keep your training safe. VYSE provides the best rate of climb speed on a single engine, while VXSE affords the best angle of climb in this condition. Though these speeds will vary under certain conditions to be discussed later, VMC and VYSE are both marked on the airspeed indicator. VMC is the low-speed red radial. VYSE is the blue radial. Less common in light twins, but worth mentioning, are V1 and V2. V1 can be defined as the takeoff decision speed. It is the maximum speed in the takeoff at which a pilot may begin to stop the airplane and remain within the accelerate stop distance. It is also the minimum speed in the takeoff following a failure of the critical engine at which the pilot can continue the takeoff and achieve the required height above the takeoff surface within the takeoff distance. V2 is defined as the takeoff safety speed. This is the speed that must be obtained after liftoff to meet the required engine-out climb performance. These speeds will be found in the airplane flight manual or pilot operating handbook for your airplane. If you are flying an older twin, it's possible that the manufacturer may not have published all of them. The AFM or POH for your airplane will include the information that you have come to expect in an aircraft manual. It will also include a number of new performance charts which we will discuss later in the program. The principles behind weight and balance calculations do not change with a multi-engine airplane. What does change is the number of variables. In your 4-seat single-engine trainer, your options for the carriage and placement of baggage were limited. In a typical twin, you will find more seats and more baggage compartments. You may have the choice of loading baggage into a nose compartment or a rear compartment or even into a wing locker. Each compartment will have its own limitations and affect the CG differently. Your loading may not only be concerned with the traditional longitudinal CG, but the lateral CG as well. The manual for your airplane will provide you with the information you need to make appropriate loading decisions. Some manufacturers even include suggested loading for common scenarios. Regardless of the suggestions, the PIC is responsible for ensuring that the aircraft is loaded within acceptable limits. This will become even more critical when we consider the effect of weight and balance on controllability and performance after an engine failure, later in the program. You should find a checklist for the aircraft in the manual. This checklist, or a derivative created from it, will be used as we pre-flight the airplane. The inspection will be much like that for a complex single. There will, of course, be more engine and engine-related systems to check. Your instructor will point out the key items required during the pre-flight of your particular make and model of airplane. In our next segment, we will meet Paul Juergens. Paul is the chief instructor for multi-engine operations at Sporty's Academy. He's been a flight instructor for over 15 years and has been recognized by the National Association of Flight Instructors as Master Flight Instructor. Paul is going to discuss how to make the most of your multi-engine training.
Training to fly a multi-engine airplane can be an exhilarating experience. Your investment in this rating will include both time and money, so you should aspire to make the most of it.
Your personal safety as a multi-engine pilot can be influenced by the quality of your initial and subsequent multi-engine training. If you're adding the rating just to have the rating, that's one thing. If you're adding the rating to use it, do yourself a favor and find the best instruction that you can. Now is not the time to be hunting for the least expensive route to the rating, as it can cost you so much more in the end. Research your options and don't be afraid to ask questions about the program, the airplanes used, and the instructors. A good program will be structured toward teaching you to fly multi-engine airplanes, not just teaching you the check ride. The flight school should be willing to review their training curriculum with you. Higher quality programs will have a list of study materials or a workbook that you should obtain and review prior to the start of your training. The airplane should be suited to your goals and well maintained. The quality of an individual instructor should be measured not only by his experience teaching in multi-engine airplanes, but by his own commitment to ongoing training and study. Once you have chosen where to train, your preparation for the training will have significant influence on the final cost of your investment. If you haven't flown for a while, do yourself a favor and get proficient in a single-engine airplane before heading to multi-engine training. You should be instrument proficient if you have this rating and want to have instrument privileges in your multi-engine flying. Review the study materials suggested by your flight school and get to know the checklist and manual for the aircraft in which you'll be training. Try to spend some time just sitting in the cockpit of the training aircraft, reviewing the procedures and the checklist. Time spent alone in a quiet cockpit while mentally flying the maneuvers can be invaluable to your progress. Utilize this technique throughout your training.
Finally, once you begin your training, relax and enjoy yourself. Learning will occur much more easily if you're having fun while acquiring the necessary skills and knowledge.
Secured in the cockpit of your multi-engine airplane, you're ready to begin your first flight. Starting the engines will likely be different than in a single-engine aircraft. Most multi-engine airplanes only use a key for the doors. The magnetos and the starter will be on switches. Follow the checklist procedures. When taxiing, you must remember that the engines are now out on the wings over the wheels. This will require you to use caution when nearing a taxiway edge and when cornering. The propellers could come in contact with an object that your wing would normally pass over. Taxiing a light twin can be accomplished using the rudder pedals and brakes. You can enhance the turning capability and save the brakes by using a technique known as differential thrust. When using differential thrust, you apply additional power to the engine on the outside of the turn, allowing it to pull you around. You reduce the additional power just prior to straightening out from the turn. The before takeoff engine checks are performed on each engine individually. This prevents having two engines pulling against the brakes at an elevated power setting. The before takeoff checks should include a briefing on the actions to be taken during your planned takeoff profile. This should include planned actions for normal operations and those for the occurrence of an engine failure or abnormality.
The important thing is that the decisions must be made before the takeoff roll begins. Reactions should be nearly automatic based on where you are in your takeoff profile. We'll discuss this briefing in more detail later in the program.
The normal and crosswind takeoffs will be performed much like those in a complex high-performance single. set your flaps as appropriate, and complete any deferred before takeoff items before entering the runway. During this mode of flight, the throttles will be used together. It's a good idea to get lined up on the runway and apply moderate power to both engines prior to brake release. Ensure that the engine instruments for both engines are as expected. Release the brakes and apply the recommended power setting for takeoff. In most light twins, this will be full power. Rotate at VR. If one is not specified, rotation should not occur until 5 knots faster than published VMC. After liftoff, accelerate to your appropriate climb airspeed and set your pitch for your climb. When the profile conditions are met, ensure that you have a positive rate of climb and raise your landing gear. Set your cruise climb pitch, power, and trim when at a safe altitude. You will now need to synchronize the propellers of your twin to minimize the noise and vibration level. If your airplane has a system for this, your instructor will show you how to use it. To sync the props manually, set both propellers to the same RPM setting using the tacks. Fine-tune the speeds by listening and making minor adjustments to only one propeller control. You should find a sweet spot where the engines sound smooth and any wah-wah or thrumming sound is minimized. During your climb, you may find the need to add right rudder pressure just as you do during your single-engine flying. This need will be dependent on a key design factor, the direction that the propellers are turning on each engine. Many twins have both of their engines turning the same direction. These airplanes are subject to similar torque effects as discussed early in your single-engine training. Differences occur due to the position of the engines. Other airplanes have the engines turning in opposite directions from each other. These airplanes are commonly described as having counter-rotating propellers. When viewed from behind, the propellers on a traditional U.S. manufactured twin both rotate clockwise. This places the descending blade on the right side of the engine. During flight at higher angles of attack, the descending blade has a higher angle of attack than the ascending blade. Because the descending blade of the right engine is further from the airplane's center of gravity than the descending blade of the left engine, a higher yawing moment is created on the right side of the airplane. This P-factor-induced moment will yaw the airplane to the left, unless counteracted with rudder. With counter-rotating propellers, the distance from the descending blade to the CG is equal on both sides. The yawing moments cancel each other out when both engines are producing the same power.
While we're speaking about aerodynamics, there are a couple of other items we should note.
As you have probably surmised, a twin-engine airplane has 4 forces acting on it just like other airplanes. When both engines are operating, you have a comparatively large thrust vector, which is the sum of the 2 offset thrust vectors that we have been discussing. This gives most light twins a significant climb advantage over their single-engine brethren when all is well. A less intuitive difference in the 4 forces is the production of induced lift. Since the engines on most light twins are attached to the wings, there are localized areas of the wings receiving the accelerated slipstream of the propellers. Let's get back to your first flight. After you've flown around for a bit and perhaps tried a few familiar maneuvers, you will return to the airport. Descent planning in a multi-engine airplane requires a bit more thought than when flying a low and slow single. Cruise altitudes and speeds tend to be higher. Higher performance engines also require more TLC. Power reductions should be gradual whenever possible. Temperatures should be monitored and kept relatively stable. Arriving at the traffic pattern, you will need to blend in with other aircraft using the airport. At a typical general aviation airport, you may be the fastest aircraft in the pattern. Do not use this extra speed as an excuse to fly an extra-large traffic pattern worthy of a 747. It's often best to slow the airplane down and complete your initial before-landing checks prior to entering the downwind leg. Once established on the downwind leg, verify that the landing gear is locked down and complete any intermediate before landing checks. You will likely find that things are happening very fast now in the traffic pattern. They will seem even faster during your first few flights. Fly the traffic pattern as you would in any complex airplane. Verify that the landing gear is down and locked after turning on each leg. Complete any deferred before landing checks once on final. Fly a stabilized final approach at the recommended speed. Work toward being stabilized prior to descending below 500 feet AGL. As the pilot of a heavier airplane, you'll find it necessary to anticipate any power changes before they are needed. The airplane will take a moment to stabilize at the new power setting. For example, if you are above the correct approach path as noted by this too light PAPI, you would reduce the power slightly to join the correct path. If you wait until the lights are red and white to reapply power, you'll probably find 2 red lights in front of you when the airplane stabilizes at the new power setting. The airplane's inertia simply takes a while to be overcome. As you near the runway for the landing, verify that the landing gear is down and locked one last time prior to committing to the touchdown. This is the final over-the-fence check of the gear. The round out in a multi-engine airplane should be smooth but not to the point of a full stall. Reduce the power and apply enough back pressure to allow the mains to touch down first, but fly the airplane onto the ground. Float will be minimized by the higher wing loading of the aircraft and the drag of the windmilling propellers. Maintain the elevator back pressure and crosswind corrections throughout the rollout. The back pressure will provide maximum aerodynamic braking. Utilize the wheel brakes as necessary. Once clear of the runway, come to a stop for the completion of the after-landing checks. As with all retractable landing gear airplanes, it's a good idea to slow down your checks and confirm that the flap handle is in your hand before raising the flaps. An anti-retraction mechanism should prevent gear retraction on the ground, but failures can occur. During shutdown, wait until the propellers have stopped moving before turning off the magneto switches. Larger engines tend to have some inertia, and you want to ensure that all of the fuel is burned out before turning off the spark.
Before we move on to our training maneuvers, let's take a quick look at some systems that you'll need to understand as a multi-engine pilot.
Throughout this program, we'll take a look at system examples coming from several common multi-engine airplanes. These include the Seminole and Aztec from Piper, the Duchess and Baron from Beechcraft, and the Cessna 310. We'll also include a look at some of the unique systems on Diamond Twin Star. Our first look will be at engines, propellers, and fuel systems. Most light twins will have engines like those found on higher performance singles. Some, like the Piper Seminole, the Beech Duchess, and the diesel-powered Twin Star, are less than 200 horsepower per side. These do not qualify as high-performance airplanes. The Duchess and the Seminole both have counter-rotating propellers. The 0360 engine on the right side of each airframe has its designation preceded by a letter L. This indicates a counter-clockwise or left-turning engine. The diesel engines on the Twin Star are full authority digital electronic control or FADEC equipped. This system controls the manifold pressure, propeller speed, and mixture through a separate engine control unit or ECU on each engine. As the pilot, you set the power desired as a load percentage, and the ECU makes the adjustments. Each engine also has a backup ECU. If the system detects a fault, it will switch to the backup computer system and provide you with an alert. There is also a switch to make this exchange manually if the automatic system fails. The propeller systems on twin-engine airplanes are designed to feather or streamline with the wind when the engine needs to be secured in flight. Feathering occurs when oil pressure is removed from the propeller governor. The pressure is removed via a feathering valve using the propeller control or may occur due to a loss of engine oil pressure. A combination of springs, counterweights, nitrogen pressure, or aerodynamic forces may be used to turn the blades to feather when the oil pressure is removed. The Seminole and 310 may be equipped with unfeathering accumulators. The accumulator will have two chambers with a piston or bladder in between. One chamber will be filled with a high-pressure nitrogen charge. The other chamber will hold the oil. When the engine is running, the governor will fill the oil side of the chamber with oil under high pressure. This causes the piston or bladder to move and compress the nitrogen. When it comes time to unfeather the propeller in the training environment, the propeller control is moved forward out of the feather position. This releases the oil from the accumulator and into the propeller system, where it pushes the blades out of feather. This makes restarting the engine easier because the forward motion of the airplane may allow a windmill restart or may assist the starter. The diesel-powered Twin Star comes standard with accumulators. These are controlled by the FADEC system. When it comes time to restart an engine with a feathered propeller, you simply turn on the switch. The ECU unfeathers the propeller and the engine will restart via windmilling. There is a centrifugal locking mechanism installed within the propeller system to prevent feathering during normal shutdown. This mechanism uses a collar or pins which are disengaged by the rotation of the engine. When the locking mechanism is disengaged, the propeller may feather. As the engine slows to a normal idle speed, the mechanism will engage and prevent feathering during shutdown. This is needed to prevent excessive loads on the starter and vibration on the engine during subsequent startup. Normal operation of the propeller through the governor is controlled via a combination of flyweights, pilot valve, and speeder spring. These work to control the oil flow to a piston in the hub of the propeller. The operation is similar to the operation of a constant speed propeller on a complex single. The big exception when comparing these systems is that most singles will go to a fine-pitched low blade angle when oil pressure is removed. The flow of the oil from an overspeed or underspeed condition is reversed in a twin as compared to a single. The engines and propellers for most twins are controlled through individual mixture, propeller, and throttle controls. The standard order is for the throttles to be to the left, the propellers to be in the center, and the mixtures to be to the right. The throttle and propeller controls are reversed on some older Beech aircraft. The Twin Star has only one power lever for each engine. The FADEC controls the manifold pressure, propeller, and mixture settings required. Fuel in a multi-engine airplane is supplied to each engine from an independent fuel system. There will be some mechanism to get at least part of the fuel from one system to the opposite engine in an emergency. This is known as cross-feed operation. It's typically used to correct a fuel imbalance or for extended range when operating on only one engine. The fuel system on the Aztec contains 4 main fuel tanks, 2 in each wing. Each fuel valve allows you to open the flow of fuel from one of the 2 tanks on that side. When changing between the inboard and outboard tanks, the valve goes through the off position. The Aztec uses a separate pressure cross-feed valve to interconnect the 2 fuel systems. Either the engine-driven or the electric fuel pump from the fuel source side must be operating to get fuel to the opposite engine. The fuel system on the Cessna 310 can contain up to 6 tanks, 2 main tanks, 2 optional auxiliary tanks, and 2 optional wing locker tanks. The fuel selector allows you to select the fuel source for a particular engine. The choices include the main and the auxiliary tanks for that same side and cross-feeding from the opposite main tank. There is not an option to cross-feed from the opposite auxiliary tank.
Many of the maneuvers you'll perform during your training will be the same as or similar to those performed for your single engine rating. Others will be completely different. In this segment, we'll cover the differences in the common maneuvers and the new maneuvers under VFR.
In addition to the normal and crosswind takeoffs, climbs, approaches, and landings that we discussed earlier, you will also be required to perform short field variations of these. For the short field takeoff and climb, set the manufacturer's recommendation for flaps prior to entering the runway. Position yourself for maximum runway use. After completing your lineup check at moderate power, continue to hold the brakes and apply the recommended takeoff power setting. Give the engine instruments another quick scan and release the brakes. Accelerate to your rotation speed and establish a pitch attitude for accelerating to and climbing out at VX. Confirm a positive rate of climb and raise your landing gear at the appropriate time. Once clear of obstacles, lower the nose and establish a normal climb attitude. For the short field approach and landing, a power-on, stabilized approach is important. Select your desired touchdown point and complete the traffic pattern and before landing checks as you would for a normal landing. Stabilize your aircraft on final at the recommended approach speed and angle. Perform your final verification of the landing gear down and locked position prior to crossing the last obstacle below your approach path. After crossing the last obstacle, reduce the power as required to touch down at your chosen point. Do not chop the power, as this may cause the airplane to accelerate toward the ground. Fly the airplane onto the runway. Utilize maximum aerodynamic and wheel braking after touchdown without skidding or compromising control of the aircraft. It is generally not a good idea to raise the flaps in the hopes of better braking. It's too easy to grab and raise the wrong handle while in a hurry. Go-arounds require a smooth application of full power to both engines. Pitch up and establish a climb attitude. Raise the flaps incrementally if possible. Do not raise the landing gear until you have a positive rate of climb. Failure of the flap system can lead to a no-flap landing. Weather conditions and other situations may warrant a partial flap landing. You will likely practice these in your training. No flap or partial flap landings in a light twin will require an increase to the approach airspeed and more runway. If an approach speed for the configuration is specified by the manufacturer, use it. If not, use 1.3 times the stall speed in the given flap configuration. In a multi-engine airplane, the FAA recommends that high-altitude training maneuvers be done at an altitude that will allow recovery at or above 3,000 feet AGL. Only 1,500 feet is suggested for the same maneuvers in a single-engine airplane. You will be required to perform steep turns, slow flight, power-off stalls, and power-on stalls to obtain a multi-engine rating. Other than the minimum altitude, the performance standards are the same. Operationally, you need to understand that you are flying a heavier airplane with more power. As with other airplanes, you should perform clearing turns prior to performing most maneuvers. Steep turns may require trim and power adjustments after entry into the turn. Don't forget to adjust these back after exiting. Slow flight will require you to not only monitor outside the airplane, but the engine instruments as well. When performing a power-off stall, use caution when applying power during the recovery. Asymmetric thrust near the stalling speed can lead to a spin if mistakes are made. Bring the throttles up smoothly and slow enough to determine that both engines are coming up to the desired speed. Do not abruptly apply full power near the stall speed or while at or below the VMC red line on the airspeed indicator. Don't forget that you must have a positive rate of climb prior to raising the landing gear during all stall recoveries in a complex airplane. Power-on stalls will require a power setting less than full power in most light twins. This will reduce the pitch required to initiate the stall. The FAA does not want the pitch to exceed 30 degrees nose up. Awareness of the aerodynamics and situations where spins can occur is also required. You must understand how to recover from inadvertent spins. Intentional spins are not recommended or approved in most multi-engine airplanes. Spins in some multi-engine airplanes may be unrecoverable.
Before we take a look at some maneuvers unique to multi-engine training, let's take a look at some principles of flight with only one engine running.
There are two critical components to flying a multi-engine airplane on one engine: controllability and performance. Of these, controllability is the most significant. No amount of performance will help you if you don't have control of the airplane. The rudder is primary for maintaining directional control in an engine-out condition. The ailerons and elevator also play important parts. The rudder is used to directly counteract the yawing force of the asymmetric engine thrust. The ailerons are used to offset any rolling tendencies and raise the inoperative engine side slightly during straight flight. The elevators are used to set a pitch attitude that will ensure sufficient airflow over all of the control surfaces. During an engine inoperative situation, the natural tendency of the airplane is to yaw and roll toward the inoperative engine. Assuming that the yawing tendencies are being controlled, the primary rolling force is the loss of the induced flow over the wing on the inoperative side. This factor decreases the lift on that wing. The induced lift on the operating side attempts to raise that wing and creates a rolling moment toward the inoperative engine. This must be counteracted with aileron. If the yawing tendencies are not being controlled, additional lift is created on the operating side wing. This is due to its increased velocity through the air as a result of the rotation. New airplanes that are to be certified as normal, utility, acrobatic, or commuter category are certified under FAR Part 23. Many airplanes flying and being produced today were certified under its predecessor, CAR 3. During certification, a minimum controllable airspeed, or VMC, was established by the manufacturer. This value is marked by the low-speed red radial on the airspeed indicator. VMC is defined by the regulations as the calibrated airspeed at which, when the critical engine is suddenly made inoperative, it is possible to maintain control of the airplane with that engine still inoperative and thereafter maintain a straight flight at the same speed with an angle of bank of not more than 5 degrees. The method used to simulate critical engine failure must represent the most critical mode of power plant failure expected in service with respect to controllability. It was established using specific criteria which should represent a near worst-case scenario for controllability, assuming proper pilot technique. The critical engine mentioned in the definition is the engine whose failure would most adversely affect the performance or handling qualities of the aircraft. An engine might be considered critical due to its direction of rotation, or it could be related to important systems on only one engine that increase the pilot's workload when unavailable. Light twins are considered to be those having a maximum gross weight of 6,000 pounds or less. Light twins that stall at 61 knots or less in the landing configuration must meet the following criteria for the establishment of the low-speed red radial. First, the criteria noted in the definition apply. Additionally, VMC must have been determined with the most unfavorable weight and center of gravity position. The airplane must have been airborne and out of ground effect. The airplane would have been configured for takeoff with maximum available takeoff power on each engine, flaps and trim set for takeoff, landing gear retracted, and all propeller controls in the recommended takeoff position throughout. Heavier multi-engine aircraft, turbine-powered aircraft, and light twins with a stalling speed greater than 61 knots must also have been evaluated for single-engine controllability in the landing configuration.
The published VMC speed is merely a reference. After our discussion on the performance component, you'll see how we can change the actual minimum speed for control.
The ability of any airplane to climb is a function of horsepower in excess of that needed to maintain level flight. With 2 engines producing full power, excess horsepower is abundant and the airplane climbs well. When only 1 engine is producing power, we have lost half our total horsepower. We have lost a much higher percentage of our excess horsepower. As an example, let's assume that a particular airplane requires 200 horsepower to maintain level flight in a clean configuration with both engines running. The airplane has 2 250 horsepower engines producing a total of 500 horsepower. This provides an excess horsepower value of 300 horses. If one of the engines fails, we are now producing only 250 horsepower, or 50% of the power. Our excess horsepower is now only 50. This is over an 83% decrease in excess horsepower. Climb performance will certainly suffer by more than 50%. So, does our climb performance decrease by 83%? Actually, it could be more. Our assumption was that the airplane requires 200 horsepower to maintain level flight in a clean configuration with both engines running. With only one engine running, additional drag and other factors extract a penalty on the horsepower required for level flight. In other words, we will require more than 200 horsepower to maintain level flight with only a single engine, thus further decreasing our excess horsepower. In fact, it is possible that we will run out of excess horsepower and we will begin a descent. Light twins that stall at 61 knots or less in the landing configuration are not required to be able to climb on one engine. For certification, the manufacturer simply needs to determine the climb or descent gradient at 5,000 feet with one engine inoperative. Heavier multi-engine aircraft, turbine-powered aircraft, and light twins with a stalling speed greater than 61 knots must be able to climb and have more stringent certification requirements. The absolute and service ceilings on a single engine will be lower than with two engines operating. The definition for absolute ceiling does not change. It is the altitude where the climb rate reaches 0 feet per minute. The criteria for the service ceiling in a twin is different with one versus both engines running. The single-engine service ceiling is the altitude where the airplane can only climb at 50 feet per minute on one engine. The two-engine service ceiling is based on a climb rate of 100 feet per minute.
Controllability and performance are not independent of one another. Control and configuration inputs that have a positive effect on one may have a detrimental effect on the other. Let's take a look at a number of these factors and see what they do for each.
The left engine is considered to be the critical engine on traditional U.S.-style twins with both engines turning the same direction. This is due to the left turning tendencies already present with two engines in operation. The critical engine situation is exacerbated on some aircraft by the important system issue. An example found in older Piper Aztecs and Apaches is that the only engine-driven hydraulic pump is also on the left engine. Not only must you overcome the turning moment when the critical engine is out of action, but you must operate the manual hydraulic pump to raise or lower the landing gear and flaps. Unless there is a system-related or other issue, aircraft with counter-rotating propellers are often considered to have no critical engine. This means that performance or handling qualities are affected the same regardless of the engine that fails. You might also say that both engines are just as critical. The bank angle of the airplane influences both controllability and performance. By banking to raise the inoperative engine, you create a horizontal component of lift that decreases the need for rudder input. This enhances controllability, but at the cost of performance.
While we could use bank angle to lower our VMC substantially, it may not be worth the price to performance. One use of bank that is positive to both controllability and performance is something known as setting zero side slip.
If you keep the wings perfectly level and maintain directional control of the airplane strictly with the rudder, the airplane will slide sideways through the air. In this situation, the operating engine is trying to turn the airplane in the direction of the inoperative one. You counteract this turning moment by applying rudder toward the operating engine, creating a force on the tail to push it toward the inoperative side. The combination of these forces creates a force vector which causes the airplane to slide somewhat toward the inoperative engine. This can be demonstrated in flight by placing a yaw string at the center of the windscreen. As the airplane moves forward and slides sideways, it presents the side of the fuselage into the relative wind. This creates additional drag and decreases the airflow over the rudder as it gets masked by the vertical stabilizer. The additional drag decreases performance. The decrease in the flow over the rudder decreases controllability. You can prevent the creation of this force vector by applying a slight bank toward the operating engine and releasing a bit of the rudder pressure. The horizontal lift component is used to counteract the sideward force vector. This allows the airplane to track straight through the air, increasing both performance and controllability. The amount of bank required varies from one airplane to the next. Most light twins will require a bank of 2 to 3 degrees. The right amount of rudder pressure will put the ball of the inclinometer slightly out of its center position. Essentially, you will want to center the ball of the inclinometer with the index line that is toward the operating engine. An easy way to remember how to set zero side slip is to remind yourself to raise the dead engine and split the ball. If you'd like to determine more precise zero side slip settings for your twin, fly with your instructor with a yaw string attached. The most unfavorable weight and center of gravity for control of most light twins are a low weight and an aft CG. These were the criteria for establishment of VMC. These same criteria are the most favorable conditions for performance. A lower aircraft weight requires a smaller lift vector while in an unaccelerated climb. This will create a proportionately smaller horizontal component when established in a zero side slip. All other factors being equal, a heavier aircraft will have a slightly lower actual VMC. The further aft the CG, the less controllable the airplane is during an asymmetric situation. This is due to the leverage of the rudder. When the CG is in the forward part of the envelope, the distance between the CG and the rudder is greater, and the rudder has a longer leverage arm. With the CG near the rear of the envelope, the leverage arm is shorter. For the same amount of rudder force, the yawing moment is less. The performance of the aircraft is more concerned with the distance from the CG to the elevator. This relationship has to do with the tail downforce required while in flight. Another condition which was used for determining VMC is that both engines must have been set for maximum available takeoff power prior to the failure of one engine. This would indicate that the engines were producing their rated takeoff horsepower and would imply standard conditions at sea level. When one engine is failed, the operating engine is still producing the specified horsepower. Any decrease in the horsepower on this engine would decrease the yawing moment created by the engine. This would increase the controllability and provide a corresponding decrease in actual VMC. Decreased power on the operating engine would also decrease the excess horsepower available and thus be detrimental to performance. For the VMC certification test, the flaps were set for takeoff. Some multi-engine airplanes require partial flaps for takeoff. Extended flaps tend to have a stabilizing effect and thus may increase controllability slightly. From a performance standpoint, flaps produce both lift and drag. These may be a performance wash in the takeoff position. The landing gear was in the retracted position for the VMC determination. The landing gear tends to have a stabilizing effect when down. It acts a bit like the keel of a boat, slowing any tendency to turn. This improves controllability and would lower the actual VMC. On the other hand, having the landing gear down degrades performance due to its added drag. The final criterion used during certification for VMC is that all propeller controls must have been in the recommended takeoff position throughout the test. In most light twins, this means that the inoperative engine was windmilling during the test. A windmilling propeller creates a significant amount of drag on one wing. A windmilling propeller is detrimental to both controllability and performance. You can reduce the drag of the propeller significantly, improving both controllability and performance by streamlining it to the relative wind. We call this feathering the propeller. It both stops the rotation and decreases the surface area of the propeller that is presented to the relative wind. That's a lot of information. This chart provides a comparison of the effects of various conditions we've discussed for your review. It's a bit easier to review in tabular format.
Now that you understand the principles of flying on one engine, let's go out and practice a few maneuvers where these principles must be applied. As with other maneuvers, you should prepare with a pre-maneuver checklist and clearing turns where appropriate. Altitudes for most of these maneuvers should be such that you won't descend below 3,000 feet AGL.
Most instructors will give you an opportunity to fly the aircraft on one engine prior to throwing you into single-engine emergency procedures. Your introduction to asymmetric thrust may be simulated by reducing the throttle on one engine, or you may do a controlled shutdown and securing of an engine in flight. Feathering can be simulated on an operating engine by using the zero thrust setting recommended by the manufacturer. Use the blue radial as your VYSE reference at this point. Set zero side slip for best efficiency. Utilize trim to reduce the control forces. While flying on one engine, you will perform the four fundamentals: straight and level, turns, descents, and climbs if the airplane is able. The throttle on the operating engine will be adjusted as required for the maneuver. Turns will be performed in both directions. For these, you have to maintain sufficient airspeed, and remember that the airplane will want to roll more quickly toward the inoperative engine. Don't allow this to happen. Stay in control of the flight. After sufficient practice, you will resume two-engine flight. The secured engine recovery begins with the manufacturer's recommended restart procedure. If your airplane has a pressure accumulator, this greatly aids the process. Without an accumulator, you must start the engine in the feathered position. Once sufficient oil pressure builds up in the governor, it will take the propeller out of the feathered position. The engine should be warmed up sufficiently before proceeding with the application of additional engine power. The primary flight controls and trim should be reset for two-engine flight. The drag demonstration is not a required maneuver for the private or commercial multi-engine check ride. It is required for the flight instructor rating. Your instructor may show you this demonstration regardless of your rating level. The objective of the drag demo is to show you the effect of various configurations on the climb characteristics of the airplane. The VMC demonstration, or loss of directional control demonstration as it is sometimes called, will have you take the airplane to its lower limit of controllability on one engine and recover. This maneuver requires some forethought with regard to the altitude to be used during the maneuver. First, we will want to be at least 3,000 feet above the ground. This does not mean that higher is necessarily better. Recall our discussion that actual VMC gets lower as our altitude increases. This is due to the decreased power on the operating engine. Our stall speed, on the other hand, remains relatively constant. Most light twins start with a VMC speed that is higher than the stall speed. As altitude increases and VMC decreases, it approaches the stall speed. Above a certain altitude, actual VMC will be less than the stall speed. If the airplane were to be slowed above this altitude to attempt to reach the actual VMC, a stall would occur first. A stall with an asymmetric thrust condition would result in a spin. There is no guarantee that this spin would be recoverable. The key is to prevent the stall and avoid the conditions necessary for a spin. That being said, you must recover from the VMC demonstration at the first indication of loss of directional control, the first buffet, or the first sign of stall. Whichever sign or indication comes first, recover. To begin the maneuver, slow the airplane to 10 knots over VYSE. Ensure that the landing gear is retracted. The flaps, cowl flaps, and trim are set for takeoff, the mixtures are set as required, and the propellers are set for high RPM. Maintain airspeed while reducing the power on the critical engine to idle and increasing the power on the operating engine to takeoff or maximum available power. Establish a zero side slip condition. Slowly apply back pressure to begin reducing airspeed at the rate of 1 knot per second. Maintain directional control with the rudder. At the first sign of loss of directional control, stall warning, or buffet, recover. Do this by reducing the power on the operating engine enough to regain control and decreasing the pitch attitude. After regaining control and accelerating above VMC, reapply full power to the operating engine and pitch for VYSE. Establish a climb or minimized descent at VYSE. Recover to a cruise configuration with both engines operating when advised by your instructor or examiner.
After learning these basic maneuvers, your instructor will move on to emergency procedures. We'll take a look at multi-engine emergencies in an upcoming segment. First, let's take a closer look at some of the more common systems you may encounter.
All light twins use hydraulic pressure for activating their wheel brakes. The hydraulic brake system is normally independent of any hydraulic system used to raise or lower the landing gear. The Aztec, Seminole, Duchess, and Twin Star utilize hydraulic pressure for raising and lowering their landing gear. Of these, the Aztec uses a mechanical hydraulic pump and the others use an electric hydraulic pump. The primary hydraulic pump for most Aztecs is located on the left engine. It pumps hydraulic fluid freely about the system when the left engine is running. To raise the gear, you move the mechanical thumb latch and raise the gear handle. The handle is attached to a valve which redirects the flow of the hydraulic fluid to the upside of the gear actuators and releases the pressurized fluid from the downside. When the gear reaches the up position, pressure builds up in the actuators to hold the gear up. When the pressure reaches a certain level, it forces the gear handle valve back to its neutral position, trapping the pressure in the upside of the actuators. Lowering the gear releases and traps fluid in the opposite sides of the actuators. The Aztec also uses its hydraulic system for raising and lowering its flaps. Electro-hydraulic landing gear systems may utilize different methods of raising and lowering the landing gear. The Twin Star uses a one-way electric hydraulic pump and a series of electrical valves to direct the fluid in the proper direction. When the gear lever is moved, it actuates the appropriate valves, and a pressure drop turns on the hydraulic pump. When the gear reaches its fully extended or retracted position, limit switches stop the operation. The Baron and Cessna 310 utilize an electric motor to raise and lower the landing gear. The gear handle switch determines the direction that the motor will turn. Limit switches will shut off the motor when the gear reaches its appropriate position. All modern landing gear systems have some type of safety device to prevent retraction of the landing gear while on the ground. The most common device is a squat switch or squat valve located on one of the main landing gear struts. The squat switch is opened by the weight of the airplane on the landing gear. When open, electrical power is cut off from the landing gear system. The squat valve found on the Aztec uses a similar principle. It prevents pressure from being directed to the gear up actuators while the airplane is on the ground. These devices are not infallible and should only be used as a backup to prevent an inadvertent gear retraction. Another feature found on all of our landing gear systems is a method to lower the gear in the event of some failure in the primary system. The Aztec uses a manual hydraulic pump for its first defense backup system. The hand-operated pump can be used to lower or raise the landing gear and flaps in the event that the mechanical pump fails. A last resort method of emergency gear extension is also available on the Aztec. This system utilizes compressed carbon dioxide, which can be directed into the down actuators in the event that hydraulic fluid is lost. This is a one-time use system and can only be used to lower the landing gear. The Seminole, Duchess, and Twin Star all use a free-fall system to lower the gear in an emergency. A valve or lever in the cabin is used to release the hydraulic pressure holding the gear in the up position. the gear falls or is assisted by springs into the down and locked position. The Baron and the 310 both have hand cranks for use in lowering the landing gear. Human power takes the place of electrical power in turning the gearbox to lower the gear.
Before we talk about what to do when an engine quits unexpectedly, let's take a look at some of the performance calculations you'll need to do before each flight in a multi-engine airplane.
Looking through the POH for your airplane, you will see a number of familiar performance charts. There will be graphs, charts, or tables for takeoff and landing distances, normal climb performance, performance in normal cruise, range, and endurance, and others that you've seen before. We won't spend any time on these here, but you should use many of them during your training. You should also see some new charts. Accelerate stop is common, as is single engine rate of climb. You may find a chart for single engine service ceiling. Accelerate go, or best single engine climb speed. These new charts are the ones we'll be looking at over the next few minutes. Like all airplane performance data, these charts were developed with a very experienced test pilot at the controls of a brand new airplane. Keep this in mind as you go through the planning process. Be conservative in your decision-making. The accelerate stop distance is the distance required to accelerate from 0 knots up to a specified speed. The takeoff is then aborted and the aircraft is brought to a stop. The chart will specify the speed and the conditions upon which it is based. It is often assumed that an engine failure is the reason for the abort. Some charts do specify this, others do not. Know the conditions for your airplane and don't assume something that isn't stated. Takeoffs may be aborted for other reasons, and the distance has value in these situations as well. While not required for FAR Part 91 operations, it's a good idea to use the calculated accelerate stop distance as your minimum runway length requirement. The conservative pilot will add a buffer to the accelerate stop distance when determining if the runway is sufficient. The accelerate go distance starts out the same as accelerate stop. The aircraft starts out at 0 and accelerates to a specified speed. At the specified speed known as VEF, an engine is assumed to fail and the takeoff is continued. The accelerate go distance is the distance from the start of the takeoff roll until climbing over 50 feet above the ground. In many of the light twins with an accelerate go chart, VEF is assumed to be the liftoff speed. If the manufacturer of your airplane did not include an accelerate go chart, there's probably a reason why. Do not plan to continue a takeoff after an engine failure without this information unless sufficient speed and altitude have been obtained. Determining your single engine rate of climb is very important for multi-engine flying. Many of the decisions regarding your flight will be based upon this information. As with all charts, verify the conditions specified for this rate of climb. If the chart indicates that this climb rate is with the gear and flaps up and the propeller feathered, you won't get the calculated rate in any other configuration. Some manufacturers will list the climb penalties for variations from the stated conditions. Remember, even with the gear and flaps up and the inoperative engine's propeller feathered, your calculation may show a descent. As previously described, your single-engine service ceiling is the altitude where the airplane's rate of climb will slow to 50 feet per minute. Some manufacturers include a chart for this ceiling. If one is not included, you can work backward using the single-engine rate of climb chart. Start with a 50-foot rate of climb and work back to the altitude where this will be obtained. It's important to know these altitudes when planning a flight in a multi-engine airplane. In the event of an engine failure while cruising at a higher altitude, your airplane will begin to descend. If your technique is perfect and the airplane is otherwise operating perfectly, you will drift down to the absolute ceiling. If everything is not perfect, the service ceiling may be a better altitude to use for planning. What kind of planning do you need which requires this number? Well, for one thing, you will need to compare this number to the terrain that you'll be flying over. If the terrain is higher than your single-engine service ceiling, you need to plan for alternatives along your route. Determine what airports you can reach during your single-engine descent. Find out if there is suitable lower terrain near your route which you can reach. If an engine failure will leave you without alternatives, consider if there is another route to your destination that has more options. The best single-engine rate of climb speed varies based upon weight and density altitude. Some manufacturers provide a chart or table to calculate the correct value. Other manufacturers only give the blue line value of VYSE. Planning for emergencies should begin on the ground. Like in all flying, you should continue to reevaluate your emergency plan until you are safely on the ground and secured.
As previously mentioned, every takeoff should be preceded by a takeoff briefing. During this briefing, you are telling yourself and your instructor what decisions you have made about the takeoff. This briefing is a statement of your emergency plan so that it can be put quickly into action if needed.
The decisions you make may be critical to a successful outcome in the event of an emergency. The information presented here is a potential thought process for a light twin. It is not definitive. Your airplane and the conditions may warrant different decisions. A before takeoff briefing might sound something like this.
This morning we'll be doing a normal takeoff on runway 4 with a static run-up prior to brake release. We'll rotate at 85 and climb out at 120. Please monitor the engine gauges and speed throughout the takeoff and call out any abnormalities you see. In the event of an engine failure or other abnormality prior to rotation, we'll abort the takeoff. If we have an engine failure after takeoff and prior to gear retraction, we'll land straight ahead on the remaining runway. If we have an engine failure after gear retraction, we'll continue the takeoff straight ahead and enter a left-hand traffic pattern for a landing back on runway 4. Our departure will be straight out until we're 500 feet above the pattern, and then we'll make a right turn on course up to 6,000 feet. Any questions?
An engine failure on the ground before VMC requires quick and appropriate action. Upon detecting a failure, or even an abnormality, you should reduce the power on both throttles to idle while maintaining directional control with the rudder pedals. These actions should be nearly simultaneous. Failure to perform either promptly, and the airplane can end up off the side of the runway. As the takeoff progresses, your single-engine rate of climb calculations come into play. For an engine failure after rotation, but prior to reaching VXSE or VYSE, you are in the most hazardous area of decision. In some cases, it may be best to retard both throttles and quickly transition to an approach and landing attitude. Land on the remaining runway and apply maximum braking consistent with safety. In other cases, it may be best to assume an attitude that will allow acceleration to VYSE. Work through the emergency checklist, and continue the takeoff. If there are obstacles, and you are still below them, you will have to decide if a climb at VXSE will allow you to climb over them. Your single-engine rate of climb calculations and experience as a multi-engine pilot will play a part in determining the best case for you during this phase of the takeoff. If your calculations tell you that the airplane won't climb even when cleaned up, your best option will be planning for an immediate landing. After accelerating past VYSE and climbing above any obstacles, you will likely be beyond any landable runway. You should have a positive rate of climb, and your gear should be transiting up. Your plan for an engine failure at this point will be primarily dependent on your calculated performance of the aircraft. If you anticipate a reasonable climb on one engine, you would likely plan to follow the emergency procedures while continuing to climb. It is very similar to the engine failure procedure in cruise flight, except that we will go more quickly to securing the engine. As with cruise flight, fly the airplane first. Maintain directional and roll control while pitching for VYSE. Realize that VYSE on a single engine may be a lower pitch attitude than a two-engine climb at VY. Apply full power by pushing both sets of mixture, prop, and throttle controls full forward. Minimize the drag, ensuring that the flaps are up and the landing gear is up. Identify and verify the failed engine. Follow up the engine verification with feathering the propellers on the inoperative engine. Raise the dead engine slightly and set zero side slip. If performance and altitude permit, review the emergency checklist to ensure completion of appropriate items.
The procedure for the airplane should become a rhythmic mantra, something like directional control, pitch for blue line, mixtures full, props full, throttles full, flaps up, gear up, identify, verify, feather, set zero side slip. Learn the mantra well, and it'll stick with you when you really need it.
After obtaining a safe altitude, you would either plan to enter the traffic pattern for a landing at the airport you just departed, or plan to proceed to a nearby airport with better landing options. The presence of VFR or IFR conditions could play a part in this decision. If you expect a descent on one engine, your altitude and rate of descent will determine your options. Like an engine failure in a single-engine airplane, your best option may be a controlled descent nearly straight ahead. If altitude and performance permit, it may be possible to return to the airport, but you must maintain adequate flying speed while maneuvering. VYSE will provide the lowest rate of descent.
Let's take a look at a typical process to be followed during an engine failure in cruise flight. If this differs from the manufacturer's checklist, follow their instructions.
The first step in handling an engine-out emergency is fly the airplane. In cruise flight, the appropriate airspeed may vary. It should be VYSE or greater. If your airplane will maintain level flight at a speed higher than the blue line, use this speed. It will provide better cooling for the operating engine and provide more margin for error. If the airplane cannot maintain altitude, pitch for VYSE. The next series of steps are intended to ensure that sufficient power is available. Both sets of mixtures, props, and throttles should be set as required. At higher altitudes, you may not want to push both mixture and controls to full rich. If you have both engines leaned for cruise, move them both forward enough to ensure that you are getting the best power from the operating engine. The propeller and throttle control settings will depend on your airplane and the conditions. If you are maintaining altitude at a speed above blue line with the current settings, you can probably leave them where they are. If you are descending at VYSE, push both propeller controls and both throttles full forward. After setting the power, it's time to ensure that the drag is minimal. Verify that the flaps are up and that the landing gear is up. Now determine which engine has failed. These steps are known as identify and verify. Identify the dead engine by identifying which of your feet is not doing any work. They will both be on the same side. This can be remembered using a phrase like dead foot, dead engine, or idle foot, idle engine. Reaffirm your identification by stating it out loud. Saying identify left or identify right will help solidify the appropriate response during your next steps. Verify that you have identified the correct engine by reducing throttle on that side only. If nothing happens, you have the correct engine. If you suddenly start losing power on the operating engine, push the throttle forward. If the power returns, you had the wrong throttle. Assuming that your flight path is stabilized and that you are at a safe altitude, you can begin to troubleshoot the problem. Troubleshooting is generally only a good idea while in cruise flight. If you don't have sufficient altitude to do it safely, it is best to move on to securing the engine. Troubleshooting involves looking at the potential sources of the engine failure and making changes to try and resolve it. The first place to look is usually at the fuel. Use caution as you make any changes to the fuel selectors to ensure that you don't interrupt the fuel to the operating engine. Don't forget to bring the verified throttle far enough forward after making a change to ensure that the engine isn't running. If the fuel system does not appear to be the culprit, take a look at the system that provides spark to the cylinders. Verify that the magnetos are turned on. Try each ignition circuit individually. If your engine has a FADEC type system, you may have the option to switch from the primary engine control unit to a backup engine control unit. These types of systems also require electrical power to operate. Ensure that the circuit breakers are in. The next item to evaluate is the air supply to the engines. Open any available alternate air door or turn on the carburetor heat. If none of this works to restore engine power, it is time to secure the engine. Ensure that the verified throttle is in its idle position. Check the RPM on the windmilling engine to ensure that it is high enough to feather the propeller. If the RPM is too low, you may need to increase the airspeed slightly if altitude permits. Grasp the propeller control for the inoperative engine and confirm that you have the correct control with a verbal feather left or feather right. Pull it smoothly into the feather position. Ensure that the propeller on the correct engine feathers. Do the following for the inoperative engine. Pull its mixture control to idle cutoff. Shut off the fuel pumps and valves for that side. Turn off its magnetos. If the master switch allows separate control, turn off the alternator for that side. Close its cowl flaps. Declare an emergency and turn toward a suitable airport. Adjust the power and cowl flaps on the operating engine to ensure its longevity. If your engine has a max continuous power setting, you may need to reduce the power to this setting. Ensure that fuel will continue to flow to the operating engine. If the engine was secured due to an actual failure, attempting a restart is strongly discouraged. Accidents have occurred during attempted restarts with defective engines. Once you've made the decision to secure, stick with it. After any unresolved airborne engine failure, there will be a single engine approach and landing. Preferably, the landing will be at an airport. You will practice these under simulated conditions during your training. A light twin that is unable to climb after losing one engine will likely still have the ability to cover more ground during its descent than a single-engine airplane that loses its only engine. This likelihood opens up a number of additional landing options in an emergency. For now, we'll concentrate on landing the airplane at an airport under visual conditions. If you have a choice, select an airport based upon its runway length and directions, its elevation, and its surrounding terrain. A landing on one engine will require more runway. The wind conditions on the surface are important. The ability of the airplane to handle a crosswind during the round out and on the ground can be diminished on one engine.
Just like with two engines, it's a good idea to review an approach briefing prior to pattern entry. This briefing should include information about the runway, about the weather, about your plans for the traffic pattern and its speeds, and about your decisions on the landing gear and flaps.
Complete the before landing checklist. Deferring landing gear and flaps is required. Enter the traffic pattern and establish your predetermined speed for the downwind leg. Lower the landing gear when at a point where you are assured of making it to the runway with the gear down. If the performance of the aircraft will allow, it's best to fly a normal traffic pattern. This provides you with familiar cues and the best potential for a stable approach. Your approach angle should be approximately the same as with two engines, provided that the airplane is capable of this angle. Throughout the traffic pattern, fly the appropriate speeds. Do not allow yourself to get into the habit of adding a few just in case knots or flying a bit higher on final approach. Established on final approach with your final gear and flap settings, maintain VYSE until your landing is assured. As always, this is a good time to verify that the landing gear is down and green. Stabilize your approach at the recommended VREF for the configuration and wind conditions. Once you slow the airplane to VREF, you are committed to the landing. If the inoperative engine is feathered, attempting a go-around should not be considered possible after this. Attempting one can lead to loss of control. As you reduce the power on the operating engine during the roundout, you will need to reduce your asymmetric thrust control inputs even further. As the operating engine comes to idle, you will need to reverse the directional control inputs. The added drag on the operating side reverses the asymmetry. Fly the airplane onto the ground with the mains touching down first. There may be more tendency for the airplane to float due to the reduced drag. If the inoperative engine is still set for zero thrust or feathered, be prepared for the airplane's tendency to weather vane toward the operating engine after touchdown. This tendency will be aggravated by a crosswind from that side. This can be overcome by the proper use of rudders, steering, and brakes.
A moment ago, we mentioned that a go-around should not be considered possible after stabilizing at VREF with the landing committed. Is a single-engine go-around ever a possibility in a light twin? The answer to that question is a resounding, it depends.
It may be possible, but it should not be considered common practice. It is an emergency maneuver in a capable aircraft for use in avoiding an accident. The decision to perform the go-around must be made while the airplane still has several hundred feet of altitude. This requires you to recognize early that the approach isn't stabilized or will otherwise have a negative outcome and act upon the situation. Smoothly apply full power on the operating engine while simultaneously adding rudder pressure to the operating side. Do not let the nose swing about wildly. Pitch for VYSE. Decrease the drag by raising the flaps and landing gear. Set zero side slip and assess your climb performance. If the performance is inadequate, determine an alternative course of action. The failure of an engine is not the only emergency that you must be able to handle as a multi-engine pilot. You will need to review the emergency procedures you learned as a single-engine pilot, modified for the new aircraft. You will also need to determine when a situation warrants declaring an emergency.
Before we take a look at instrument flying in a multi-engine airplane, let's finish up our discussion on common systems.
Multi-engine electrical systems come in 14 and 28-volt varieties with 12 or 24-volt batteries. The systems tend to have an alternator or generator on each engine with a single battery. Most electrical systems provide for load balancing between the two generation devices. This is typically done through some type of connection between two individual voltage regulators. The system should prevent a single alternator or generator from being required to carry the entire load and can lead to longer component life. It should also be designed to allow one alternator or generator to pick up the full load if the other unit fails. If a charging unit fails, you may be required to decrease the electrical load on the system to prevent damage to the operating unit. A method for re-exciting an alternator field circuit should be available if a transient overvoltage spike takes the unit offline. This may be a matter of turning off the affected alternator's switch, resetting any breakers, and turning the switch back on. Some airplanes, like the 310, may have an emergency alternator field switch that allows a more direct connection between the battery and the alternator field circuit. 5 of the 6 light twins featured in this program use a gas-fired combustion heater in the nose to heat the cabin and provide windscreen defrost. The exception is the Twin Star. The Twin Star uses heat from the right engine to warm the front seats and the floor. Heat from the left engine is used to defrost the canopy. The combustion heater in the other 5 models burns avgas from the fuel system. A series of blowers direct the heated air into the cabin and onto the windscreen. Controls within the cabin should be available to control the temperature of the air. Some type of fuel shutoff may also be available. Under certain conditions, it's possible for one of these combustion heaters to overheat. This should trip an overheat sensor within the unit and shut it down. Normally, this sensor cannot be reset in flight. Pressurization may also be available when flying heavier twins. Pressurization systems do vary. Get a thorough checkout if your twin is so equipped. If the airplane is capable of pressurization and has been certified for operation at greater than 25,000 feet, you will need a high-altitude endorsement to act as pilot in command. More common on light twins is the availability of a supplemental oxygen system. The horsepower available with a multi-engine airplane makes getting up to oxygen-required altitudes a real possibility. If you plan to fly at these levels, know the oxygen requirements and the capabilities of your system. Always keep grease away from oxygen fittings. Use caution when using oxygen while wearing petroleum-based skin products. Minimize ignition sources to the extent possible. Remember that oxygen does not burn, but it will intensify existing ignition sources and fires. A number of the example aircraft have been manufactured with anti-ice and optional de-ice equipment. The Baron, Aztec, and 310 could all have been delivered with wing and stabilizer pneumatic boots. The Twin Star is available with a glycol-based de-ice system. Heated, booted, and liquid-based de-ice for the propellers have been used. Windscreen protection appears as liquid-based and heated plate-based. Just because your Twin has some de-ice protection does not mean that it is certified for flight into known icing conditions. The pilot operating handbook assigned to the serial number of your airplane should define the capabilities and certification of the system. Even when certified for flight into known ice, there are icing conditions that may overwhelm the system. It's best to only use the available systems as a means to escape the icing conditions. Something that you may find in your light twin is an onboard radar system. These were and are available as an option on a number of aircraft. If one is available in your aircraft, you'll want to learn about this valuable tool. Self-study with one of the radar-related books or programs available from Sporties will help make your time with an instructor go much more quickly. Other systems available for weather avoidance are readily available as aftermarket and factory-installed systems. Installed lightning detection has been around for some time. Newer systems may provide data from NexRad radar and ground-based lightning detection stations, current METARs and TAFs, and a whole host of other weather products via uplink from ground stations or satellite downlink. These products are viewable in the cockpit through a multifunction display. One caveat with these systems is that they are not real-time. The inherent delay makes them inappropriate for threading through fast-moving weather systems. They should only be used for reviewing the big picture and staying out of the area.
Thus far, our discussion of multi-engine flying has been constrained to visual flight conditions. Now let's take a look at instrument operations. Going somewhere under IFR is where the utility of a multi-engine airplane really shines.
Flying IFR with two engines is much like flying IFR in a high-performance, complex single. Things happen quickly and require planning. Your departure planning under IFR should include a review of the required climb gradient of any departure procedures. Will the airplane be able to meet these gradients if one engine fails? What are your alternatives if the airplane cannot meet the climb requirement? The planning should also include a review of local instrument approaches. If an engine should fail, what are your best options? Considering the cloud heights, the visibility beneath the clouds, the anticipated performance of the airplane, the terrain around the airport, and other factors, what will be your best course of action if an engine fails prior to climbing into the clouds? If you can reach the minimum circling altitude for an approach at the departure airport with adequate performance prior to cloud entry, cautiously circling back to land may be a good plan. Your decisions from this planning should be a part of your before takeoff briefing on an IFR flight. The en route portion of the flight may require fuel and engine management tasks along with the usual IFR requirements. You generally will have time to plan for the arrival at your destination. You should develop a descent plan that will be the least stressful on the engines and passengers. Many multi-engine airplanes have some type of autopilot installed. Yours may even have a flight director. If either of these is available, they can reduce the workload when used properly while flying single-pilot IFR. Learn how to use these tools in your airplane to assist in flying. Don't rely on them as a crutch. Failing to know the system's limitations, how the modes of the system operate, and how to interrupt power or disable the system can be dangerous. An arrival briefing becomes more important under IFR conditions. As with the VFR briefing, include the anticipated runway and winds and your plans for an emergency. In addition, you'll want to set up and brief the approach to be flown. Briefing the approach can help to ensure that it goes smoothly.
Your plans for an emergency will depend on the airplane being flown and the conditions for the day. It may also depend on how far along you are in the approach.
For example, consider a situation where you are flying well below the single-engine service ceiling for your airplane. You are anticipating an approach to minimums at your destination airport, but the conditions are localized. VFR conditions may be found within 25 miles, and altitude requirements to get there won't be a problem. If an engine fails before reaching the initial approach fix, it might make sense to divert to the VFR conditions. Approaches in a multi-engine airplane may be done at higher approach speeds than you are used to seeing. This could mean that your approaches fall under a different approach category. Higher approach ground speeds will mean higher descent rate requirements during both precision and non-precision approaches. Your radio calls and fixed crossing requirements remain the same as in other instrument flight. As with all instrument flying, a stabilized approach profile is essential. When flying a non-precision approach, determine the descent rates that will be required for each segment, considering your higher ground speed. Establish your planned approach airspeed early enough to keep the approach stabilized. Utilize available drag devices and good planning during descents to minimize shock cooling of the engines. Complete a before-landing checklist prior to reaching the final approach fix. The landing gear and approach flaps can be deferred until beginning the descent at the final fix. Final propeller and mixture settings might also be deferred until descent. After passing the fix, lower the gear and flaps as required, set the power, and begin the descent. Upon arrival at the MDA, lead the power application for level off to compensate for the momentum of the airplane. Confirm that the landing gear is down and locked after level off. Having approximate power settings in mind for each segment and configuration will help. The runway environment must be spotted at a distance sufficient for landing without radical maneuvering. If the conditions for the approach are met, a descent to landing may be initiated. During the descent, the airplane should be slowed to normal VREF and the flaps should be configured as required for landing. Execute an appropriate landing for the runway. If the runway environment is not seen in time or the conditions for the approach are not met, a missed approach will need to be executed. Apply appropriate climb power and pitch settings and raise the flaps as required. Confirm a positive rate of climb and raise the landing gear. Execute the missed approach instructions. Adjust the cowl flaps as required. The precision and LPV approaches should also be flown as stabilized approaches. Planning for the approach should include an anticipated vertical speed to maintain the glide slope at the expected ground speed. The airplane should be slowed to the approach airspeed, and the before landing checklist should be completed with the usual deferrals before intercepting the glide slope. When the airplane is 1 dot below the glide slope needle centering, the landing gear and approach flaps should be lowered and the power set for the descent. Intercept and follow the glide slope. Upon reaching the decision altitude, complete the landing if conditions permit or execute the missed approach. If landing, check the gear one last time as you slow to VREF and set the flaps as appropriate. Maintain the visual glide slope during this transition.
We've looked at engine failure training and emergencies in VFR conditions, and looked at flying a multi-engine airplane under IFR. Now let's take a look at what you'll need to know when an engine quits while flying IFR.
In actual IMC, or while training under the hood, your only references for maintaining control of the airplane are the instruments. When an engine quits, you need to quickly and accurately interpret the instruments to determine the appropriate actions. As always, your attitude indicator will give you an indication as to the aircraft's attitude to the horizon. Use it initially to keep the wings level and pitch set as appropriate. Your heading indicator will tell you that yaw is occurring and that the heading of the aircraft is changing. The turn coordinator or turn indicator can give you a quick indication of the direction of the yaw. The rudder required will be the one that is opposite of the turn indication. Use this instrument to stop the yaw and the heading indicator to resume the desired heading. Your airspeed indicator will provide information regarding the adequacy of your pitch attitude. Use the desired airspeed to fine-tune the pitch attitude. Your altimeter will give you an overall indication of how your airplane is performing. Climbs, descents, or level altitudes are important to note. The overall procedures for your initial response to an engine failure under IFR do not change. Only the references used to interpret the situation change. If an engine quits, fly the airplane using the instruments as reference. Establish an airspeed of VYSE or greater. Set the mixtures, props, and throttles as required. Verify that the flaps are up and the landing gear is up. Identify and verify the dead engine as done under visual conditions. Assuming that your flight path is stabilized and that you are at a safe altitude, troubleshoot the problem. If troubleshooting does not restore engine power, feather and secure the engine. Utilize your pre-flight planning and your current aircraft performance to determine your best course of action. Continuing to your destination should not be a priority. Actually declaring an emergency will get you all of the assistance that ATC has to offer. If your cruising altitude was above the airplane's single-engine service ceiling, you will be drifting down during this entire process. Your planning should indicate if this will be an issue with regard to being able to maintain required minimum IFR altitudes. If you will remain above the minimum altitudes, you will have more time to determine and implement your best course of action. If drift down will put you at an unsafe altitude or on the ground, you must react much more quickly. Assuming that you will remain at a safe altitude, determine if there are VFR conditions nearby. ATC can help out if you don't recall from your planning. If you can safely proceed to a suitable nearby airport and execute a visual approach, this is often best. If VFR conditions aren't present, it's time to analyze your best instrument approach options. Ideally, you would like to find a suitable airport with an approach that is well above minimums and that will allow a straight-in landing. An approach to minimums on one engine, which will require circling to land on a short runway, stacks the cards against a successful outcome. If you are adequately equipped, a precision or LPV approach to a straight-in landing on a long runway with conditions well above minimums would weigh things in your favor.
If the single-engine ceiling is below ground level and IFR conditions are prevalent, you have an urgent emergency situation with limited options. This emergency would be similar to an engine failure under IFR in a single-engine airplane. You might have the advantages of traveling a longer distance and redundant systems on the operating engine. Discussion of options that could lead to a successful outcome in this situation is beyond the scope of this program. The rest of our discussion will assume that a safe altitude can be maintained and that we must fly an instrument approach.
An instrument approach with only one engine can be a complicated process. It requires good instrument skills along with good skills as a multi-engine pilot. Judgment must be used to determine if and when to change the configuration of the aircraft. Power settings that work with two engines won't work with one. Like any instrument approach, you need to have a stabilized approach. If you are not ready for the approach when cleared, request a vector to allow you time to set up. It is better to delay the approach while getting ready than to rush the setup. Being unprepared for the approach will decrease your chances of success. Your basic setup for a non-precision approach will be the same on one engine as with two. Complete a before-landing checklist prior to reaching the final approach fix, but do not lower the gear or flaps. You may be required to fly the approach at VYSE if that's what's necessary to maintain altitude. If you can fly at your normal approach airspeed and still maintain altitude, this will give you a safety buffer. Leveling off from any descents will require additional altitude due to your limited power. Plan a sufficient lead. Upon acquiring the runway environment and in a position to land, ensure that the landing gear is locked down. Reduce power and begin a descent to the runway. Establish VREF when the landing is assured and complete the single-engine landing. A precision or LPV approach on one engine provides a constant descent angle upon glide slope intercept. This fact, along with lower altitude minima, make these approaches best for an approach with an inoperative engine. As with two engines, complete the before landing checklist prior to glide slope intercept. Defer the landing gear and flaps until an appropriate time. Decide the appropriate time based on the aircraft performance and the conditions of the day. Realize that you may be committing yourself to landing once the gear is down. Also, realize that you may destabilize your once stable approach if you wait too long to lower the gear. If the approach is unsuccessful, a missed approach on one engine can be a very hazardous proposition. You face the same concerns as a go-around with the addition of the instrument environment. You also need to be concerned about any climb gradient requirements for the runway. Like the single-engine go-around, the earlier and higher you make the decision for the missed approach, the better the chances for a positive outcome. Better still, find an approach where a missed approach is unlikely.
As you can see, an engine failure in the instrument environment will demand a great deal from your skills. If you plan to fly a multi-engine airplane on instruments, you do need to keep these skills honed. Even the pros require regular practice to stay safe in this environment.
Now that you have the multi-engine rating, what's next? First and foremost, you need to maintain your skills. Develop a plan to regularly visit with your favorite multi-engine instructor and stay in practice. This is important even if you are flying a twin on a regular basis. The skills you need to keep sharp are the emergency skills you hope you won't need. You might want to get checked out on a make and model other than the one you used for your training. Each airplane is unique and will require a complete checkout. You might even try out a centerline thrust aircraft if you learned in a more traditional twin. Now that you have your multi-engine land rating, perhaps a multi-engine sea rating is in your future. These can be a lot of fun. Maybe you'll have the opportunity for a checkout in a turboprop or the pursuit of a type rating. The doors are now open to these new opportunities. Make the most of them.
Thank you for joining us for this Sporty's What You Should Know series video on learning to fly multi-engine airplanes. If you'd like to find out more about multi-engine flying, take a look at any of the excellent books on the subject, available from Sporty's. You'll be glad that you did. On behalf of all of us here at Sporty's Academy, I'm Rob Ryder. So long.